hiccup. Okay. All right. Well, hey, I want to welcome everybody to our second lesson in our lunchtime learning series, where we talk about basic, how to reduce, reuse, and recycle solid waste. And I'm Jason. I'm going to be joined by my co-host, Melanie Case. Hello, Melanie.
Hi, Jason. Hi, everyone. Thanks for spending some time with us on your lunch hour. Jason has a great program available, and this program, the Master Recycler Composter Program, is a partnership between Lewis County Public Works Department and the WSU Extension Office. And Jason does a great job of training volunteers and helping them go out and educate the public about waste reduction, recycling, and composting.
All right. And if you have any questions about that, I'm going to have some information at the end of the presentation, and I'm more than willing to stick around if you have some more questions about that. Okay. All righty, so we're going to, this is the second lesson again in basic composting. Kind of give you a little recap for those who weren't here last week. Lesson one, I talked about what compost was, which is a semi-homogeneous soil-like material that's great for improving your soil structure. If you have clay, sand, silt, whatever, it improves water availability, nutrient availability for your plants. It reduces landfill waste. So there's up to 60% of our organic waste goes in, our organic material, I should say, goes into the landfill unnecessarily. So that all that material can be used for compost. So it's going to save us, it's going to save you money at the dump, and it's going to save us some valuable land. So we're not having to fill it up with perfectly usable garbage. So today I'm going to be talking about soil organisms, particle size, pile volume, mixed ratio, moisture, oxygen, temperature, and time. And these are the main elements of composting. And I like to think of these as ingredients to a cake, right? So this is your flour, your sugar, your eggs, and all this other stuff. And it combined in the right balance, it's going to create this beautiful compost for you. So, but it's about learning how to use these elements properly. And sometimes it takes some, it takes a lot of experimenting and trial and error and all that. But once you get it and get the right balance that you want, you'll find that it gets easier and it gets funner as you go. All right. All right. So first, soil organisms. So I like to think of composting as a microorganism farm. So that we have all these different microorganisms. Some of them are microscopic. Some of them we can see. You got your bigger, beetles and worms and things like that. And then you have your bacteria, your protozoa and whatnot. And all of these work together as they're tunneling through the compost pile, they're creating holes, or tunnels through for air and water and whatnot. They're eating each other, really, and the fertilizer that they produce from that is consumed by something else. So there's this continual biological, powerhouse going on in your compost pile, and so everything kind of has its own purpose. So fungus, or molds and yeasts and things like that. Critters are eating all that. Worms would kind of include, obviously the red wigglers. That's what you most commonly see in a compost pile, but also earthworms and nematodes and potworms, the little tiny guys. Those are all doing something great for your compost pile. Obviously the arthropods, the ants, the beetles, the spiders, and all this other stuff that are kind of, over all of it, kind of looking at, they're hunting, they're eating, they're fertilizing and whatnot. So it all kind of works together, and I'll discuss that in this next slide. So bacteria is really the most important the most important organism in your compost pile, because they are actually producing the most heat. They're consuming the most organic matter. And so there are three of the basic bacteria, we call them the phials. So these are the different bacteria that prefer different parts of your compost pile. The cyclophiles, they are in the on the outside of the pile, right, where it's a little bit colder. The mesophiles, they're more like, you know, in between the middle and the outside, and then the thermophiles, those are the heat-loving bacteria, and those things are the ones that are really putting out more heat, which actually helps your pile break down even quicker, and we'll talk about that a little later. So as you're turning your pile, all these bacteria moving, so everything from the middle is working its way, you know, to the outside and vice versa. So when you're disturbing, you know, where they're at in the pile, that movement is going to create that much more heat, right? And that much more opportunity for other organisms to munch on them. So here's just a basic food web of the compost pile. You know, down here you have your organic residues and everything you put in there, and then the bacteria, the molds, and all this other stuff is going to be eating all that. And so you can see that there's quite a food web going on, and all these are important. So a lot of people are like, well, I got spiders in my compost pile, and you know, all this stuff, and fantastic, that's a good thing. So you really want to welcome these things, and you really want to actually want to celebrate that they're there, because they're doing a great job for you. And by the way, just if anybody has any questions during any of what I'm saying, feel free just to let me know. You're welcome to unmute and or send me a chat. I forgot to mention that. You can send me a chat, and we'll be monitoring those. So if you have a question, feel free to do that. Okay, so let's go right on to the particle size. So particle size really is about the surface area of what bacteria are going to be eating. Let's see, let somebody else in. So you want to think of particle size as, you know, think of it like a block of ice, right? So a huge block of ice is going to melt really, really slow. But when you break up that ice, you know, into smaller chunks, it's going to start melting faster. And the reason why is because there's more surface area. And so the surface area is really important for bacteria, because as we break up these larger sizes, we're creating more surface area for the bacteria to munch on.
Jason, I'm not sure if you see in the chat box, Ardith is wondering, on the previous slide, are there any organisms that you don't want in your compost pile?
Yes, that's a great question. So let me go back to that. So pretty much anything on this is good. What you really don't want, obviously, are going to be your macroorganisms, your, you know, rats is the biggest thing, you know, mice, obviously, you know, some of the large vertebrates, raccoons and things like that. You don't want anything like that. Although you can make the argument that, yeah, they probably contribute somehow, but you really, if you can avoid, and that'll be in another lesson too, but you want to try to eliminate as much of the larger vertebrate critters in your pile. So that's a good question though.
And I'll just mention that, you know, sometimes you'll look in your pile and you might see some things that look a bit gross. Mm-hmm. Like you might see maggots or fruit flies or things like that. And I mean, those are all good things that you want in your pile. And if your fruit flies are getting really annoying, I recall some of the volunteers suggest freezing a lot of your kitchen waste. Mm-hmm. Like if during canning season, especially, you might have a lot. And then just parceling it out a bit at a time. And then when you're adding it to your compost pile, making sure that it's buried, like you have some dry material on top, like dried leaves or grass.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, burying is a really big deal. And we're going to be doing another mini worksheet workshop on worm composting, and we'll mention that as well. So that's a great point, Melanie. Thank you. Okay, so back to particle size. So you want to make sure that that like the watermelon, the big large sticks, you know, you want to try to make those, you want to try to break them up as much as you can, because it will break down a whole lot slower. You know, there's obviously you do want some larger pieces. Like these sticks will be fantastic for you know, for airflow, to kind of keep some of those pockets in there. But it's not going to break down nearly as quickly. Now, if you don't really care too much about how fast your pile breaks down, if you have a year, great. You know, you can have the bigger pieces in there, and it's, you know, the chunks of watermelon or whatever you have in there, they're going to get moldy, and that's going to be more food for something else. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to have the larger stuff, but if you do want to make compost quicker, I highly recommend you break up some of those pieces. Okay, so this, like, again, it just creates more surface area and more food for the bacteria. So there is something, a little caveat. You don't want the pieces to be too small, because it'll fill in all those little pores and things like that. You know, you don't want to put all your stuff in a blender and just, you know, pack in all that stuff. Yeah, it's going to give it's going to provide some nutrients and some moisture and whatnot, but you want to have that balance of you know, medium sized to small parts of the organic waste, just really to make it beneficial for not just for the pile, but just for the individual organisms that are going to be breaking it down. And so about the pore space, that's something that's obviously, you know, if anybody has clay soil, there's no pore space, and that's why it doesn't release, it doesn't hold water, it just sits on the top, right? And so kind of the same thing, you want there to be some airflow and whatnot in there, and so having those pore spaces open is really important, and we'll talk more about that too later. Any questions? Okay. Pile volume. This is a really big deal, because people have always wondered, well, how big should I make my compost pile? And these are just some, you know, just basic things that you can try, and that'll be our last lesson on different composting methods. But you really want something that's not going to be any smaller than about a cubic yard. Now you can do something smaller. You can have, say, a 2x2x2, you know, in a 20-gallon, 30-gallon, you know, container, something like that. But you really need to insulate it big time, because what happens is it doesn't produce enough heat for the compost to break down. There's still going to be a lot of organisms and all the other good stuff that's in a regular pile, but you need to make sure that it has enough heat, right? So it needs to be large enough to hold the heat and moisture, and that's another big thing. Is if it's too small, it could possibly dry out. Okay, and then small enough to admit air to the center. So right here, in this one here on the right, yeah, that's a really good size bin. But what you can do to improve that, if you're not going to be turning it all the time, you know, put something in the middle, like a PVC pipe or something like that, where you can get some air to it. Now, on the upper end, you can get away with it, like probably a 5x5x5 size compost pile. But any more than that, you're going to be doing more work, maybe even with a tractor. You know, you don't want anything so big that you can't even maintain. I know it's really tempting to make the most use out of a small space in your yard or garden, but yeah, try to make it between a cubic yard and again, you know, 5 feet by 5 by 5. So, questions? Okay, mix ratio. This is where it can kind of get complicated, and this is going back to the whole baking a cake thing. You know, what do we, you know, how much flour works for this, and how many eggs should you add to this, or whatever. It's really just this is something that you're gonna have to just kind of eyeball it, right? Through your composting process. So the basics of composting is you have your browns and your greens. Your browns are going to be your carbon, so it's going to be your paper, sticks, straw, dry leaves, and whatnot. And green and in the organisms, we use this for energy. Think of it like carbohydrates, like how we use carbohydrates, and it ranges from 200 to 500 parts of carbon to nitrogen. So we'll discuss that in the next slide. So there's a lot of different there's a lot of carbon and a lot of material that we have to figure out how to break down. So 1 part nitrogen is typically what we use for a ratio, and this is again for protein synthesis. This is where all the organisms get their material for growth and whatnot. So we call this the carbon nitrogen ratio, or the CN ratio, and this is how we kind of determine where we're at as far as our ingredients goes, our browns and greens. So bacteria prefer a 30-to-1 ratio. I'll talk a little bit. I don't want to get too mathematic about how to kind of figure out how to do that, but I'll discuss it on this next slide here. So this is just kind of these are guidelines. This is basically what some of these various browns and greens, what they contain as far as their ratio goes. And you notice we go by weight. We don't go by volume. So just think of it as, so food scraps on the very top. We need 15 pounds of carbon material or brown material to every 1 pound of nitrogen. So food scraps, you're not going to need nearly as much carbon as you would say with sawdust or wood, which is 500 pounds. You need 500 pounds per 1 pound of nitrogen. So all these things kind of vary, and even your leaves. Fresh fallen leaves are going to have way more nitrogen than carbon, right? So that's why it ranges 40 to 80. Once it falls to the ground, there's not a whole lot of nitrogen in there. I mean, it fades pretty quickly. And so just trying to figure out, obviously you'll know if it's brown or not, or brown or green. And so what you do to figure out this ratio, and this, I know it might seem a little complicated, but you just take this, and again, this is just a guide, really. You would say grass clippings, you just take half of this. We'll say this is 20, right? So half of this is 10, and then you take half of leaves. So instead of so you take 10 pounds of leaves, or excuse me, 10 pounds of fresh grass clippings and 20 pounds of leaves. And there's your 30-to-1 ratio right there. And so just by using this, you can kind of figure out what would be ideal for the bacteria. And like I said, it's unless you are a mathematic whiz, which I'm not, this is going to take some trial and error, and just kind of experimenting with it and seeing what works best for your pile.
Jason, will you be able to make the slides today, like this mix ratio, available to the people who are participating, like maybe email them out?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if anybody's interested in doing that, I can.
Yeah, so Rosemarie would like the mix ratio, as I'm sure other people would. And then I just wanted to add, I am not an expert composter. So I think what scares people a lot is this math and chemistry. Like, people think it has to be exact. And how I think about it is just the really high nitrogen things are the fresher, greener things, like your foods and your green leaves and the manure. Those are high nitrogen, and those need some a smaller portion of brown items, the dried leaves, paper, sawdust, to go with them. and you mix it all up. And then for compost, your goal is you just want it to smell like dirt.
Yeah.
When you have a smell that's off, and I'm sure Jason will be talking about this in one part of the series, there are ways to remedy that. And it might be like you have too much of the nitrogen or green, and then you would know, okay, I need to add some more browns to have that be a better reaction for everything.
Great point. I'm glad you brought that up, because yeah, it's the odor is a great indicator of how your compost pile is doing. If it smells just raunchy, yeah, you're probably, I mean, it's just rotten in there. You probably need to add, it probably has too much nitrogen. You need to add some browns. So excellent. And again, if it looks like it's you know, if it's breaking down too slow, that's an indication that there's not enough nitrogen. So you really need to be watching your pile. You need to be smelling your pile, and even maybe even looking for different critters in there. If you see a lot of flies and things like that, that would be an indication that you have too much nitrogen. Maybe it's food scraps or whatever. So yeah, absolutely. You got to be observing your pile. And you're right, Melanie. It doesn't have to be exact. Really, I'll be honest. My pile isn't exact at all. I mean, I kind of add and I just observe it. You know, I don't mind different textured cakes every single time I have one. You know, it's compost regardless. And so, yeah, you're right. So it does take a little bit of time to kind of figure out what works best for you. And but if you can stay within at least, you know, this recommended 30-to-1 ratio, if you can do it, great. If you can't, you know, just do what you can. Do what feels comfortable. So great comments, Melanie. All right, so moisture is a really, really big deal.
Oh, before you move on, we want, someone is asking, what about weeds in your grass clippings? Would you recommend including, so say you're mowing and then you have all of the grass clippings from your bag and you're putting those in your compost pile. What if you have the weeds mixed in?
That's a great question again, and we'll talk about that in another lesson. But yeah, weeds. So if you're chopping up, say, dandelions or something, most likely, unless there's a lot of seeds, you know, if you're mowing it, you know, when they're already in seed, yeah, you probably get some seeds in there. But it's not enough unless you really want to separate the weeds from the grass. I wouldn't even worry about it because it's going to be chopped up. There's going to be enough heat. In fact, some of those organisms like beetles, they love seeds. You know, they'll go through and eat all those seeds. And so I wouldn't waste your time trying to separate and certainly not wasting the clippings just because they have some weeds in them. But again, we will talk about when it's inappropriate to put weeds in there and what to do, kind of how to remedy that. That's another great question.
And I recall someone suggesting, I mean, if you are weeding your garden and you have like a bunch of weeds, to set those out in the sun and kill them, you know, with natural remedies. And then those can be added to your compost as more of a carbon or a brown item. Exactly.
Yep. Great point. And again, we'll cover that in, I think, the next lesson, actually. Fantastic. I love the questions. Thank you. Keep them coming. All right. Moisture. Just like anything, you know, too much or too little is a bad thing. So anything more than 60%, in 60% of moisture in your pile is going to really cause your pile to get gross, because it's not allowing air to flow through there. It's basically just literally creating a wet blanket over your pile, so nothing can get out. No airflow can get out. The different air can't get out of your pile, and fresh air can't come in. So it'll create an anaerobic condition, which is the stinky smell. And anything less than 40% causes the bacteria to slow down. And the reason why is because bacteria are like little boats, little submarines, you know, going around. They rely on the water and on the food in the pile itself to actually move around. So without enough water in there, they will actually just stop and die, really. I mean, they'll consume kind of what's around them, and then they're toast. And so keeping enough water in there for them to move around, but not enough to keep air from moving in and out is important. So 50% moisture is perfect. Now, how do you determine how much moisture you have? Well, you can buy meters and things like that for it. You can test it that way. But the rule of thumb is just, take some compost out in your hand and just squeeze it, and if a couple, 2 or 3 drops come out, it's great, like a wrung out sponge. And that goes too for your worm compost bin too. Same concept there. So we don't want too much. We don't want too little. And so that's another thing you'll need to just observe. Maybe after a rainstorm or something, go out there. If it's not covered, I recommend you covering it. Just kind of check things out, kind of dig down with a shovel or pitchfork or whatever, and just see where the middle of the pile is. I mean, if the middle of the pile is soaking wet, it has way too much water, but if it's dry on the middle, maybe you need to add more water. And so, and turning it, mixing it, and all that will mix up the water, not just the air, but the water too. And so that'll be important. So observing it is important. Covering it would be especially in Washington, we get a lot of snow, we get a lot of rain, typically hot, dry summers, this summer, So even just putting a tarp over it when it's really rainy, but still allowing some water to get in there. I actually use a mesh. It's on top of a like a chip truck kind of trailer, that type of mesh. And so I just put that over there, so it's still getting quite a bit of water in there, but not enough. There's enough that's shedding off the top of it that it's not just soaking everything. And so there's a lot of different ways. You can do a piece of plywood or whatever and just move it back maybe if it's going to rain, or put a hose in it. When you're going out there to water your yard or garden, just spray it down a little bit if it's really dry. Okay. Alrighty, oxygen. This goes back to the whole turning thing. So anytime you're moving your pile around, you're turning it, you're mixing it, that's going to increase the oxygen going through there. And it's gonna create a really a more pleasant environment for not just for your own nose, but also for the other organisms that rely on that anaerobic the aerobic decomposition. And so you don't want so much that it's going to dry out the pile. So you don't want to be out there 5 times a day turning it. Once every couple of days, maybe once a week. Some people will even just if they're not in that big of a hurry, they'll just turn it. When their compost bin or whatever gets too full, they'll just turn it then. And so I recommend weekly, really, to speed things up. At least weekly. So not enough air obviously would create the anaerobic conditions, and that's what causes it to be stinky, and it's going to cause it to be cause your pile to break down much slower, because it's not going to have it's not going to provide the environment for the organisms to be moving around as well. Okay, temperature and time. So this is really, these things go hand in hand. And like I said before, there's a balance of all these different composting elements. It's really important to make all these elements fit together as much as possible. But if you don't have a hot pile, it's going to take you forever. And next week we're going to talk about hot composting and cold composting. So it really just depends on the speed at which you want your compost, your finished compost, is going to depend on how hot you can get it. You don't want to burn down, obviously, but you can get it up to 200 degrees if you really want to get it that hot. It's going to break down a whole lot quicker. You might get compost in 2 or 3 weeks, or a couple years. Just all depends on how much effort you want to put into ensuring that you have a hot pile, and encouraging all these the bacteria and whatnot to get in there and start moving around. So turning it back to the bacteria, turning it is just going to cause more movement throughout your pile, not just your bacteria, but all your other organisms. And that movement is creating more heat, right? The manure, all the eating, all the stuff, all the biological processes that happen in the compost pile is creating more heat. So it comes down to, having enough water, having enough air, having enough organisms and mixed ratios and all that stuff. It's that balance that we gotta work on. Because really we're raising organisms. We're raising soil organisms, and the compost is just kind of a extremely beneficial byproduct, right? So that is the end reward for us being good stewards of our microorganism farm. Look at it that way. Any questions on any of this? Okay. All righty. Any questions on any of these? We covered quite a bit, but like I said, just think of these things as ingredients in a cake, right? So just doing what you can to making this great environment for your critters is going to pay off. I guarantee it's going to pay off. So, and it's okay to slack off a little bit. If you go on vacation for a month or whatever, or maybe just forget about it for a couple weeks or a couple months or whatever. That's fine. Those critters are still going to be there. Your balance won't be there, and so it just kind of take what you get. I mean, really, it all really depends on what you want to get out of it and when you want to get your compost.
Jason, I have a question,
Mm-hmm.
And it has to do with like if you don't have a
Mm-hmm.
cubic yard of material,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to just start with your little small pile, how do you make that work so that it's progressing?
So
while you're waiting for more material.
So yeah, Rosemary. So what you're saying is, basically, how do you? Let me try to put another way for me to understand there. So if you want to have a surplus of material, so if you have a smaller pile, kind of waiting for,
Mm-hmm.
is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so you can start a pile from scratch. I mean, nothing. You can start right now today with nothing. You don't have to necessarily start off with a 3x3x3, whole cubic yard of compost. You can start in layers. You can, if you've got a bunch of cardboard, everybody uses cardboard for shipping, right? So that's an excellent resource. You can throw your cardboard in there, and then maybe tonight you got some leftover scraps, throw your scraps in there, you mow your yard. I mean, just build it in time, and it's surprising how fast, even a small pile, it's surprising how fast it'll break down. It'll actually shrink. And so it's not like your pile is going to just continually build, and you just eventually run out of room. You will run out of room eventually if you're putting in more greens and browns that then can break down quickly. But you really, you can start with a lot, or you can start with a little. I recommend you start with a little. I mean, there's different methods. Some people talk about the, lasagna composting, where you do your layers and things like that. That works. To start, it still needs to be turned. You can't.
Okay.
I recommend people just starting with layers and things like that. But it is a start while you're building your compost.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, you betcha. And
I think some people might be worried about your slide where it showed the compost size needs to be 3x3x3.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like an ideal goal, but just as you explained, you can start small. Absolutely. And grass clippings and dried leaves together, if there's just a small pile, they'll break down.
Exactly. So if any of you have a bagger on your lawnmower, and you mow your yard, say you mowed up a bunch of leaves or sticks or whatever, and you say forget to dump it out, it's going to compost inside that bag, right? It's going to break down. It's going to be moldy and whatnot, but it's going to break down. And so really you can use, we say the everything compost, and really any size of a pile is going to, it's going to break down eventually. It may not be as fast as you want it to, but it will definitely break down. So yeah, if you don't have a big area, a cubic foot or a cubic yard or whatever, to compost in, you're right, Melanie. You don't have to have. That's just a guide. I mean, it's kind of the standard. It's the ideal standard for composting. So, and you know, a lot of people they don't have room. You know, balcony composters. I mean, good grief, they don't have room for pallets or whatever, these big bins, and they're still doing a great job at composting. So, and we'll talk about that in our last lesson, kind of some different compost bins and whatnot. And so, anyways, great question, great comments. I appreciate that. So don't let that size, you know, the size of the container scare you. You know, those requirements, ideal. It's just ideal.
What about, we are taking down a couple of cedar trees.
Mm-hmm.
What we're going to use some of the wood in our fireplace. What can those be composted?
I'm sorry, Art, I missed just the tail end of that. What could be composted, or what are you asking?
The leaves of the cedar tree, the fronds.
Yeah, absolutely. Now it's not going to be, even though they're green, and that's one of those confusing things. So not everything that's green is a nitrogen, and not everything that's brown is a carbon, like manure and needles. So evergreen needles really aren't. I don't really consider those a nitrogen source. Obviously, they're going to have some, but I would consider those more of a brown. But you can compost them, absolutely. But you're going to need. Remember, if you go back to the other, or if you think back about the slide about the parts, how many parts per carbon per nitrogen, you're going to need a lot of nitrogen to break down some of those heavier, more dense carbons, if that makes sense. But you certainly can compost that, you know, especially if you're going to shred it. That's a great way of doing it.
No, we don't have a shredder, I guess, and we're hesitant to run the mower over it like we do the leaf.
Yeah. So so I run over, you know, fir boughs or whatever, you know, they get in the yard, and yeah, it's fair game. So as long as your mower or whatever can handle it, absolutely, yeah, mow them up, and that's a great way of getting them mixed in with some other greens and throwing them in your pile. So
okay, and what if we don't want to mow over them? How would we?
Well, I mean, I guess you just pick them up, you know, rake them up by hand and just put them in there. Now you don't want a whole bunch of sticks, really. I mean, unless you, if you are going to do that, I would recommend maybe maybe a bigger, or even breaking them or something, just getting them as small as possible, or maybe having a slightly bigger compost area, you know, that can handle some of those bigger branches. You know, sawing them, you can do something like that. Just trying to get them into as small pieces as you're comfortable doing or able to do. For the branches, you know, some of the boughs and things like that, I'll just throw those in. It'll break down quick enough.
Okay, and is there anything that at this point we should do to even out the pH, since that's going to be very acidic?
Yes, that's a great question. So various foods and various materials are going to have different pH, right? So with a compost pile, you really don't need to, like an actual home composting pile, not a worm bin. You really don't need to worry too much about the pH. Try to keep it as neutral as possible. So a lot of evergreens, those are mostly, they're more on the acidic side. So you can just balance that out by putting, maybe some more alkaline type, maybe lettuce and different leafy greens and things like that to kind of balance that out. So as long as you're not putting all, acidic stuff in there or all, alkaline, you'll be fine. It's that, that'd be a good thing to add to this presentation as a pH, but yeah, it's going to be that balance. Try to keep it, between, say 5.5 and 7.5 pH. I mean, or even 8.5, just, somewhat in the middle. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's not nothing's gonna die in your compost or anything like that because it's too acidic or too alkaline. And so that's a good question though.
Okay.
And you can also test, just like you would test for soil nutrients, you can test compost too in the same way, really. And I can give you guys some tips on that as well later on if you have questions about that. So, excellent question. Thank you very much, Ardith. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions or comments or?
I was wondering about the cedar. You know how you use cedar on your decking and outdoor stuff because it doesn't break down? Does it take longer in the compost?
It can, yeah. If you just throw a board in your compost, yeah, it is going to take a lot longer to break down because it's a lot more, it's more resistant to rot. It's more resistant to water and all this other stuff. So yeah, I wouldn't put a lot of, I'd say large pieces of cedar or even like black locust is another great one because black locust, it takes 20, 30 years to rot, right? And so you want to avoid as much of that as you can. Now, branch here and there, leaves, things like that, not a big deal, but you don't want to be throwing in big, slabs of wood in there, or even like your boards from your deck. And too, about the decking, I'm glad you brought that up too, because, there's some wood that you don't want in there, and that's really like treated wood. You absolutely do not put treated wood in your compost pile because of the various, arsenic and copper. And even though these things are, in small, minute levels, they're really not that bad. And in fact, they're present in nature. You really don't want to add too much to your pile, especially too quick. I wouldn't put any of it personally in my compost. So if it's treated, I definitely do not put it in your compost. So, thanks, Melanie.
You may have covered this in the first lesson, or it might be in a future lesson. What are some things that you should not put in your compost? Because I've also heard something about black walnut.
Yeah.
I don't know, some other things.
Yeah. So yeah, black walnut has a hormone called juglone, and that's something that's actually will poison other plants. It's toxic to most plants. And I will cover that a little later on, but
Okay.
But you're right. That really kind of falls into the whole balance thing. You can throw some pretty toxic things into your compost pile and not even realize it, even if it's natural, like black walnut or maybe even some various wood species that might have a toxin in it that might hurt something else. And so really anything that's used for like, an insecticide or something like that, you don't want to be throwing in a bunch of citronella candles in there, right? And so, yeah, there's some things in there you definitely should avoid for sure. We'll go into it later on, but, just for right now, just while you're waiting, different types of foods that will attract pests are a really big thing. Meat scraps, cheese, things like that, unless they're buried and you have it very secure, I recommend not putting things like that in there. So, all righty. You're just trying to get all these teasers for the next lessons. I see how it is.
Yep.
All right.
So how do we access if we miss last week's presentation?
I actually uploaded it to YouTube. So I can send you a link to YouTube, or just type in Lewis County Master Recycler Composters YouTube, and it should come up. Yeah,
Great.
absolutely. And we'll put this one on YouTube as well. Fantastic.
Let's see. I was going to let you know, I had a hard time trying to find it on YouTube. And so
Okay.
when I just did a general search on Google, it came right to the top.
Okay, great. That's good to know.
YouTube link. Yeah. For whatever reason, it didn't show your channel, and anything Wazoo went straight to their sports.
I'll be darned. Okay.
Yeah, it was real frustrating.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. That's good to know. That was our first YouTube upload for any of these,
Oh, okay.
any online series. So fantastic. We'll work it out.
Breaking new ground.
Yes.
I'm so glad you're doing this, though, because I've missed live classes very much. So this is kind of a nice compromise.
We have missed the live classes. So I mentioned last week, we put on, a couple dozen workshops a year. And so, yeah, COVID has really messed us up. So we're happy to be able to do this for the community. Alrighty. Let's see here. Well, we're going to go ahead and talk about next week. So cold and hot composting, curing your hot compost, killer compost. That's going to be a really big one. Compost pests, weeds. So we'll cover that. And then pathogens, a lot of fertilizer type things. So don't miss next week. And it should be another fun one. So my plug again for Floral Park Sustainability Project. This is our newest project that we're going to be working on. It's going to be a demonstration site / family-friendly park, and we're hoping to start developing this this summer. It's probably going to take a little bit of time, so we're going to need some volunteers and obviously some material donations and financial donations. So if you're interested in helping us with that, please let me know. These are just some of the various things that we'll be covering, that we'll be displaying and talking about. And so we had our first workshop there last year on greenscaping. We had goats in there and chickens and everything else. So it's going to be a lot of fun developing this. So if you're interested in something like this, let us know. And if you're interested in the program, my number and email address is on the bottom there. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. But it's a lot of fun. Again, COVID kind of messed us up a little bit, but we love what we do. We're walking the talk and doing everything we can to help the community and help our environment. So if you're interested in joining the MRC program, we'd love to have you. Oh, any questions on this?
And are you going to be doing that training online?
Yes, I'm developing that right now. So I'd like to launch the official training by January. So we're really excited about that too. And this is brand new for Lewis County, and we're really excited. Anyways, so stay tuned.
Okay.
All right, everybody. I want to thank you very much for attending this talk and for the great questions and comments, and those comments really help me to improve the presentations. Really, I can add things later, and if I know that you are interested in something, I will be more than happy to address it. And so I do have a poll, and this is I'll be honest with you, the poll thing is definitely new to us with the Zoom, but I do have some poll questions I'd like to give you. It's all anonymous, so you don't have to worry about giving your name or anything like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and launch, well, maybe not launch it. I thought I was going to launch it. I guess I didn't save it. Okay, stay for next week and I'll have some poll questions for you. Anyways.
Thank you. Will you be sending out the connection link and stuff again?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, everybody who showed up here, I will definitely send you guys that link. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, you betcha. Thank you, everybody, for showing up.
Thank you.
All righty. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now. And again, let me know if you have any questions. Melanie and I will be happy to to talk to you about the program, talk about composting, or any of the other workshops and things that we put on. All right. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone. Have a good day.